Before sunrise, somewhere in the Sahel, the silence broke. Not with a speech, not with a headline, with impact. Within 4 days, 4 military bases in northern and eastern Burkina Faso were struck. At least 10 lives have been confirmed lost. Installations damaged. A nation pushed back into the global spotlight, now ranked at the top of the Global Insurgency Index. But is this simply another wave in a decade-long storm that has consumed the region since 2015? Or is it something more deliberate, pressure applied at a moment of transition? Why do these attacks feel like a test rather than an accident? Why are young Africans reacting with defiance instead of despair? And why does this moment carry weight far beyond Burkina Faso's borders? Let's find out. The first thing to understand is that this was not noise. It was choreography. Over 4 days, military bases in northern and eastern Burkina Faso were struck in coordinated assaults. Not a single roadside bomb, not an isolated skirmish. Installations, symbols of state authority, were targeted in succession. At least 10 deaths have been confirmed publicly. Equipment damaged. Defensive positions breached. The pattern matters more than the number.
The Sahel region has been a hotbed for violent extremist activities.
In insurgent warfare, randomness creates fear. Coordination creates narrative. When armed groups hit multiple bases in a compressed time frame, they are not simply seeking tactical advantage. They are sending a signal. We are organized, we are watching, and we can strike more than once. It is psychological warfare layered over kinetic force. Burkina Faso has been battling insurgent violence for more than a decade. Since around 2015, insurgent groups linked to broader Sahel networks have expanded across rural provinces, exploiting porous borders and weak infrastructure. Tens of thousands have died across the region. This is not new terrain, but the intensity of synchronized attacks introduces a different layer. It forces questions about timing. Why now? Why this scale? Why multiple targets instead of a single dramatic strike? Insurgent movements operate on momentum. They calculate not just military outcomes but symbolic ones. When a country shifts internally, in leadership, in security doctrine, in alliances, insurgent networks observe. They test. They probe command-response times. They evaluate whether restructuring has created temporary gaps. These 4 days look less like random violence and more like a stress test. Northern Burkina Faso borders Mali and Niger, both heavily affected by insurgent activity. Armed groups in the Sahel often operate across borders with fluid mobility. The terrain favors light vehicles, motorcycles, and decentralized command structures. A coordinated strike across separate installations suggests intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and communication capacity. This is important. Insurgent groups do not escalate blindly. They escalate strategically when they perceive an advantage or when they wish to project relevance. Because relevance is survival. If armed factions appear weak, recruitment declines. If they appear active and capable, they maintain influence. Coordinated attacks amplify that image. They send a message not only to the military, but to rural populations. The contest is ongoing. But here is the deeper layer. When violence concentrates on military infrastructure rather than purely civilian targets, it signals something specific. It is a direct challenge to the state's monopoly on force. It is an attempt to redefine who controls territory, who controls movement, and who defines authority. Burkina Faso topping the Global Insurgency Index reflects the intensity of this struggle. But the index does not explain the motive. These attacks were not random explosions in isolation. They were statements. Statements designed to test resolve, to test transition, and to test whether the state's new posture can withstand pressure. And that leads to the next question. What exactly has changed inside Burkina Faso that makes this moment feel like a deliberate test rather than just another tragic episode in a long war? What changed is not the existence of war. What changed is the framework of response. Before 2022, Burkina Faso's security posture leaned heavily on externally supported counterinsurgency models, intelligence sharing, joint operations, technical assistance, internationally coordinated frameworks designed to contain insurgency across the Sahel. The theory was straightforward. Combine resources, centralize command structures, stabilize rural zones, and restore order gradually. Yet violence expanded. By the time Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed power in September 2022, large parts of the countryside were already contested. Communities were displaced, supply routes were insecure. The old model had not collapsed, but it had not decisively succeeded either.
Forget about your plan. He's our own. He is doing exactly what the people of Burkina Faso and many other African countries wish their leaders were doing for them.
So the pivot was not cosmetic, it was structural. First, there was the recalibration of foreign military relationships. Partnerships were reassessed. Some external presences were reduced. The message was that Burkina Faso would redefine who participates in its security architecture and on what terms. Second, domestic mobilization intensified. Recruitment drives expanded. The volunteers for the defense of the homeland, local civilian auxiliaries supporting military forces, were strengthened and scaled. The strategy emphasized territorial familiarity and community integration rather than solely centralized deployment. Third, the rhetoric shifted. Sovereignty became a central theme. The narrative framed the conflict not just as counterinsurgency, but as a struggle for national dignity and autonomy in decision-making. These changes altered the battlefield without firing a shot. Why? Because insurgent networks adapt to stability, but they also adapt to transition. When command structures change, when alliances shift, when troop rotations adjust, there is always a recalibration phase. That phase can create vulnerabilities, temporary ones, but real. Coordinated attacks during such a phase are classic insurgent behavior. They test response speed. They test whether intelligence networks have been disrupted by restructuring. They test morale, and morale is critical. An insurgency is sustained by the belief that the state is either absent or ineffective. If a leadership shift signals renewed determination, insurgent groups seek to puncture that perception early. But here is what complicates the picture. The pivot under Traoré is not only military, it is political and psychological. It is aimed at reshaping how the public perceives the conflict. Instead of framing violence as an unfortunate side effect of external instability, it frames it as a confrontation that must be owned domestically. That framing resonates with a younger demographic that has grown up skeptical of outsourced solutions. Yet structural shifts do not deliver immediate peace. They introduce friction. Institutions take time to synchronize. Intelligence pipelines must be rebuilt, supply chains adjusted, training recalibrated. So when 4 bases are attacked in rapid succession, it is not necessarily evidence that the pivot failed. It may be evidence that the pivot is being challenged at its most delicate moment. Which raises a sharper question. If escalation often accompanies structural transition, how do we distinguish between a system collapsing under pressure and a system being forged under fire? To answer that, we have to confront the statistic that keeps flashing across screens. Burkina Faso now ranks at the top of the Global Insurgency Index. That ranking sounds like a verdict. It feels like a label stamped on a nation's forehead. But what does it actually measure? The Global Insurgency Index tracks the frequency, impact, and lethality of insurgent incidents over a defined period. It quantifies deaths, injuries, property damage, and psychological impact. It does not measure political intention. It does not measure reform momentum. It does not measure national morale. It measures intensity. And intensity in the Sahel has shifted southward over the past decade. While global headlines once centered on Iraq and Syria, insurgent activity is increasingly concentrated in West Africa's fragile belt. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso became the new epicenter. Vast, semi-arid landscapes with minimal infrastructure provided both concealment and mobility. Armed groups exploited weak state presence in rural zones. The battlefield expanded not because Burkina Faso invited it, but because the region became the operational core of transnational insurgent networks. Burkina Faso's geography is not incidental here. The north is wide, dry, and difficult to monitor consistently. Borders with Mali and Niger stretch across remote terrain. Communities are often separated by long distances. Infrastructure is thin. In such environments, motorcycles become weapons of speed. Small units move quickly. Retreat routes are plentiful. State forces must defend fixed positions while insurgents retain flexibility. That imbalance shapes the conflict. When 4 bases are attacked in succession, the ranking on an insurgency index amplifies the perception of crisis. But the ranking does not reveal how geography multiplies difficulty, nor does it reveal how regional contagion spreads violence across artificial borders drawn generations ago. This is not a local insurgency confined to one province. It is part of a Sahel-wide ecosystem of armed groups with overlapping networks. That is why intensity remains high even as tactics evolve. But here is the deeper issue. Indices influence global perception. Investors read them. Diplomats reference them. Media cycles amplify them. A top ranking risks portraying Burkina Faso as synonymous with instability. That perception can deter economic confidence, complicate diplomatic leverage, and shape international narratives. Yet inside the country and across parts of Africa, the ranking triggers a different reaction. For some, it confirms the urgency of transformation. It underscores that incremental adjustments were not enough. If the Sahel is the most violent theater globally, then the response cannot remain cautious or half-measured. In that sense, the ranking is both a warning and a mirror. It reflects severity, but it also reflects how central the Sahel has become in global security dynamics. So now the question sharpens further. If the data shows Burkina Faso at the epicenter of intensity, and geography explains the battlefield's complexity, why does public sentiment among many young Africans not automatically translate into fear, but into hardened resolve? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because fear is no longer new. For many young Africans, especially Gen Z, instability did not arrive suddenly with these 4 attacks. It has been the background noise of their adolescence. They grew up watching news of ambushes, displacement, and emergency meetings. They saw leaders promise stabilization year after year. They saw foreign troops rotate in and out. They saw security briefings framed in diplomatic language while villages were emptied quietly. So when Burkina Faso rose to the top of the global insurgency index, the reaction among many young people was not shock. It was recognition. Recognition that the crisis has been deep for years. Recognition that cosmetic stability never existed in the rural periphery. Recognition that the war was already there, only now it is quantified. This is where generational psychology shifts the story. Older political classes often equate calm rhetoric with competence. Gen Z often equates visible struggle with honesty. They do not interpret pressure as immediate proof of collapse. They interpret it as proof that something is being contested. Under Traore's leadership, the tone changed from managed diplomacy to open assertion. The language of sovereignty replaced the language of accommodation. The emphasis on domestic mobilization signaled that security would not be indefinitely outsourced. Whether one agrees with every method is secondary to the fact that the posture changed, and posture matters. In conflict environments, leadership tone influences morale. When a state presents itself as reactive, people internalize fragility. When it presents itself as assertive, even under fire, the narrative shifts from survival to resistance. Young Africans are deeply sensitive to narrative. They grew up online, in an era where information spreads instantly and power dynamics are constantly debated. They question why, after a decade of externally supported security frameworks, insurgency expanded rather than contracted. They question why economic frustration persisted alongside military spending. They question why rural communities feel invisible. So when 4 bases are attacked, the instinct is not simply to blame the current moment. It is to ask, what system produced this prolonged vulnerability in the first place? This does not erase grief. Civilians continue to suffer. Displacement remains a reality. Markets close when insecurity rises. Education halts in affected zones. The human cost is heavy. But Gen Z distinguishes between inherited crisis and chosen direction.
Supporting President Traoré means choosing unity over division. It also means choosing action over inertia. We therefore call on all sons and daughters of the country to remain united behind this vision, so that tomorrow we can pass on to our children a Burkina Faso that is free, dignified, and prosperous.
For them, turbulence during transition is different from stagnation during compliance. They are less nostalgic for a past that did not deliver security. They are more willing to endure discomfort if it appears tied to structural change. And here lies the core tension. If public sentiment among the youth hardens rather than fractures under pressure, insurgent groups face a different kind of resistance, not just military, but psychological. So the next question becomes unavoidable. If morale among a generation is shifting from resignation to defiance, can that shift alter the long-term trajectory of a war that geography and statistics suggest is brutally entrenched? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Morale alone does not defeat insurgency. Belief can strengthen resolve, but geography decides movement, and economics decides recruitment. Northern and eastern Burkina Faso are not conventional battlefields. They are vast stretches of semi-arid land where roads thin out, and state presence fades into the distance. In many areas, villages are separated by long, exposed routes. Security forces must defend fixed bases. Armed groups move fluidly on motorcycles and small convoys, disappearing into terrain that offers both concealment and escape. This is not a war of front lines. It is a war of reach. Insurgents exploit familiarity with local pathways and community networks. They do not need to hold territory permanently to demonstrate influence. A temporary strike is enough to create doubt. Doubt weakens trade. Doubt discourages farmers from planting. Doubt convinces families to relocate. Displacement reshapes the economic map. When communities move southward to safer zones, pressure builds in cities already struggling with employment. Informal settlements expand. Food demand increases. Agricultural production drops in contested provinces. That imbalance strains markets. It creates frustration. Frustration is fertile ground. Insurgent recruitment in the Sahel is rarely driven by ideology alone. It is driven by access to income, to belonging, to protection. In regions where state services are thin, armed groups position themselves as providers of order, however coercive that order may be. This is the war beneath the war. Military bases can be rebuilt. Equipment can be replaced. But if economic gaps widen, the conflict regenerates itself. Climate pressure intensifies this cycle. Drought disrupts farming patterns. Pastoral communities clash over shrinking grazing land. When traditional livelihoods erode, armed networks step in with cash, weapons, and promises of power. So when 4 bases are attacked, the immediate story is tactical. The deeper story is structural. Burkina Faso's leadership faces a dual battlefield, suppressing armed groups while rebuilding economic resilience in areas long neglected. That requires logistics, infrastructure, local governance, and trust building, not just patrols and checkpoints. And here lies the difficulty. Structural repair takes time. Insurgency exploits impatience. Every attack attempts to prove that the transformation is an illusion. Every rebuilding effort attempts to prove that insurgency cannot dictate destiny. The Sahel's geography complicates this duel. Borders with Mali and Niger mean instability is rarely contained. Armed networks shift across lines drawn decades ago, ignoring administrative boundaries. Regional cooperation becomes essential, but so does domestic coherence. This is why the conflict cannot be reduced to a headline about insurgency rankings. It is a layered confrontation involving land, economy, legitimacy, and movement. And if the battlefield is this complex, shaped by terrain, climate, and economic fragility, then the final question becomes sharper. Is Burkina Faso merely reacting to the crisis, or is it attempting to redesign the foundations that allowed the crisis to endure in the first place? If a country is only reacting, it fights yesterday's war. If it is redesigned, it prepares for tomorrow. That is the dividing line. Burkina Faso today stands at that threshold. 4 bases were struck in 4 days. At least 10 confirmed dead. Installations damaged. A country labeled the most insurgency impacted in the world. On the surface, That looks like a state under siege, and it is. But siege alone does not define direction. What defines direction is response. A purely reactive state absorbs attacks, reinforces positions, and waits for the next strike. A redesigning state asks harder questions. Why were rural regions so exposed for so long? Why did external heavy frameworks fail to reverse momentum? Why were local communities left feeling peripheral in their own security architecture? Under Traoré's leadership, the language has shifted towards sovereignty, local mobilization, and structural autonomy. But rhetoric must eventually translate into systems. Recruitment drives must become trained units. Volunteer defense networks must integrate into professional command chains. Intelligence must move from fragmented channels into coordinated pipelines. The test is not whether violence exists, because in insurgency, violence persists. The test is whether institutional capacity strengthens under pressure instead of fracturing. This is where generational expectation intersects with governance reality. Gen Z support is not unconditional worship. It is conditional patience. Young Africans are willing to endure turbulence if it leads somewhere measurable, reclaim territory, safer transport corridors, reopening of schools, and revival of markets. They are less tolerant of stagnation masked as diplomacy. And that expectation raises the stakes. If transformation delivers visible gains, it reshapes regional precedent. Other Sahel states observe. If it fails, critics will argue that rupture without stability is reckless. The margin for error is thin. But there is something else unfolding beneath the security narrative. Burkina Faso's insistence on recalibrating alliances signals to external actors that the Sahel is no longer a passive arena. Whether partnerships tilt east, west, or remain regionally anchored, the message is clear. Security architecture will not remain static. That alters geopolitical equations. A country redesigning its foundations does not only confront insurgents. It confronts inertia, the inertia of bureaucracy, dependency, and external expectation. That confrontation produces friction, and friction produces resistance, both armed and political. So where does that leave Burkina Faso? Not at the edge of collapse, not guaranteed victory, but in a crucible. A crucible is not comfortable. It is a space where heat tests material strength. Some structures melt, others harden. The coordinated attacks were heated. The ranking on global indices is high. Economic strain is heat. International scrutiny is hot. The unanswered question, the one that will define the next decade, is whether this heat forges a more resilient state or exposes fractures that cannot be sealed. And that brings us back to the beginning. If escalation is the response to transition, and transition is the attempt to break a decade-long cycle, then perhaps the real battle is not only on the ground in northern Burkina Faso. Perhaps the real battle is over whether a nation under fire can transform itself without losing itself in the flames. Let us know in the comment section. Is Burkina Faso winning? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.